In this video, I'm making a love note by Tin Can Knits. Knit with me from start to finish through swatching, casting on provisionally, adding bust darts, and all the details that went into making this sweater. Spoiler, it turned out great, and I had a lot of fun making it. My yarn has arrived. I ordered from Fiberspace, which is a yarn store, I think in Alexandria, Virginia. So I will open it and show you what I got. It's honestly not that exciting. I decided to go with Knitting for Olive, just their Merino and their soft silk Mohair in the Licorice colorway. This is my second time working with Knitting for Olive, and I decided to choose it again because I had some of the black left over from this sweater. But I also was really interested in trying the soft silk Mohair. I know it's a really popular yarn, but I've never tried it before, and I have not had the best experience with Mohair. I've really only tried two different types, and they were both on the more budget side, and I find it a little scratchy and irritating. Mostly the really long fibers that stick off, they will kind of like itch me and sometimes irritate my allergies. I also do have eczema. So far, it seems pretty promising. It's definitely soft, and I'm excited to see how it knits up. The first thing I'm going to do is go wind these up. You can work directly from these skeins, but I prefer to wind them, especially with the Mohair. I think that might get a little tricky. It's just nicer to work from, in my opinion. So I'm gonna go wind these up, and then we're going to get to swatching. I feel like this is a common occurrence when working with Mohair. I just got to the end of this skein and it's all knotted up, so I'm gonna spend some time working through this. Is it worth it for this much? Probably not, but I'm still gonna save it. The static electricity from winding this skein on my plastic ball winder is a little intense, so hopefully that sorts itself out. The pattern calls for a size US 10 needle for the main body, which was a little bit larger than I was expecting, and I only have the smaller of the interchangeable needle set, so I don't have a set that goes up that high. I'm pretty sure I have a size 10 in this mess of a bag, so I'm gonna go sort through this and make sure I have the right needle size. Bad news, I don't have a 10, I have 10.5 or 9s. I'm gonna start out with the 9s, and if I really can't get gauge, I'll go buy a size 10 needle. Almost everything I've learned about swatching, I've learned from this chonkster of a book. This is The Principles of Knitting by Hemmons Hiatt, and it is a lot of information, but this woman knows all there is to know about knitting. There's a whole chapter just for casting on, and there's one cast on in particular that she recommends for swatches, and ever since I learned it, it's the only cast on that I use because it really helps in giving you a much more accurate understanding of your gauge. The cast on I'm going to use is called the stranded cast on. And the reason it's great for swatching is it basically doesn't create an edge. So you can see here in this illustration that you're casting on stitches directly onto just a piece of yarn. So it's not something that you want to use really in any final product unless you want to use it as like a drawstring. But it's great for swatching because it allows the edge of the fabric to lie completely flat and unrestrained, so it won't pull at your stitches at all and distort your gauge. It's also really easy to do, so I'll show you it now. You're going to start out with a length of yarn that's a little bit longer than the width of your final swatch. And then, similar to a long tail cast on, I'm going to grab the yarn in my fingers, drape it over my pointer finger and then over my thumb. I'm going to grab onto the tail just so that it's stabilized, but you can see that the yarn running over my pointer finger is attached to the skein, and The yarn running over my thumb is the tail, so we have it set up just like this. To make the first stitch, I'm going to do what's called a right twist start. So I'm going to lay the needle down on the yarn and wrap it around counterclockwise. So the yarn's just running up, over, and behind. And this counts as our first stitch. The next thing I'm going to do is swing the needle down, come up and under that bottom strand, catch the top strand, and swing back into the same position. And that's the first part of the repeating process. To make the next stitch, we're going to do the second step of this cast on, which is simply wrapping the top strand over the needle, just like that. So you're going to repeat those two steps. To make the next stitch, we're going to come up under, and then over, and then under again, and then wrap the top strand over. Up, under, grab the top strand, come back under, wrap the top strand over. So you're just going to repeat this until you have as many stitches as you need. When you've completed the second step, the yarn's just going to be wrapped over the needle like this, and it's a little bit challenging to then start knitting from here. So what you can do is either do the first step to lock in an additional stitch, or if you don't want to add a stitch, you can twist the yarns like that. So now there's a twist at the base of your last stitch, and then you can kind of hold it in position while you turn your needle to get started. Alright, here's my swatch, completed, washed, and blocked. You can see I still have the pins in the swatch that I was using to measure. I'll go ahead and take those out. I use that technique where you can knit your swatch in the round without actually having to knit it in the round. So I'll link to a tutorial for that in the description. So I actually lucked out swatching with the 9s first. While this swatch was drying, I started swatching with the 10.5s, and just a few rounds in, I could already tell that it was going to be too loose. With how close I got to the gauge with the 9s, I suspect that the 10s would actually give me a bigger gauge than the pattern. So I took a number of measurements across my swatch, which I always do to try to get a collective average of what my actual stitch gauge is. And I know it's impossible to see the stitches in this black yarn, so bear with me, it's not really important to the video. But I'm getting multiple measurements of either 4 stitches per inch, which is what I need, or 4 1/4 stitches per inch. So when I average up all of my measurements, I end up with 1 1/8 stitches per inch, which is a very small difference. But I do want to just double check that and make sure I'm still good with the total body circumference at this gauge. So we're going to do some quick math. The total body stitches for my size is 166, and if we divide that by the pattern gauge, which is 4 stitches per inch, we get 41.5 inches. If we do the same math with my stitch gauge, which like I said is averaged to about 4 1/8, so in decimal form that is 4.125, we get 40 1/4 inches. So if my stitch gauge on average is about 1 1/8 stitches per inch, then I can expect to get something closer to 40 1/4 inches, or about 1 1/4 inches smaller than the pattern circumference.
The pattern tells you to cast on the neck provisionally, so you can pick up the stitches and knit the ribbing later. Normally, I like the crochet provisional cast on. However, in my experience, unpicking a crochet cast on in Mohair is a bit of a nightmare. So I decided to use a method where you cast on directly to another needle. That way, when you're ready to pick up your stitches, you can knit them directly off the needle. I used an interchangeable needle so I could take the needle tips off while I knit the rest of the sweater. This was a little more tedious than the crochet method, but in the end, I think it was easier than unpicking the mohair would have been. I'll link the tutorial I used in the description. Next, I decided to add short row shaping to the back neck. The pattern features a high-low hem, which accounts for some of the shaping, so since I'm excluding that, I wanted to add the shaping back in. I worked the first row flat since that was easier to do, and then I divided my stitches into thirds using stitch markers, starting from the beginning of the round, which is the back neck. My stitch count couldn't be split evenly into thirds, so I made sure the extra stitches were in the back 2/3. From there, I started working magic loop to knit in the round. It's a little fiddly with the extra cable that I'm holding my stitches on, but once you get through the first part, it does get easier. To work my short rows, I knit to the first stitch marker, turn, then work a double stitch since I'm using German short rows. Then work back across the row, past the beginning of the round, to the other stitch marker. When I get to the other stitch marker, I do the same thing. Turn, work a double stitch, knit across the row. When I get to 3 stitches before the next double stitch, I turn and work across again. I did this 3 times, so 6 short rows in total. The amount of short rows you want to knit and the number of stitches in between the turns varies depending on your gauge and size, but generally you want a couple inches of short rows and you want to space out your turning stitches so they're not as noticeable. Here's my extra wedge of fabric at the back, worked across the back 2/3 of the neck. You can adjust where you put your shaping, but I found the 2/3 method to fit really nicely. From here, I began following the pattern, removing the stitch markers and resolving the double stitches as I came to them.
Alright, it's been a few days and I made it through the yoke. So here is where I'm at. Obviously, it's a little hard to see, but I made it through the entire lace section and then also the raglan increases. So there's a small section of stockinette in the yoke before you separate for the sleeves. We have a guest today. So everything is looking good. The short rows on the back neck that I added look proportional and the lace was pretty intuitive. It's a 10-row lace repeat, and for my size you do it twice, and I didn't have any issues. It was pretty straightforward. One thing I wanted to mention is that when you make modifications, even fairly small modifications, you always want to think about how that might affect other elements of the design. So for example, adding in the short rows at the neck, you would think that that's a pretty small modification that wouldn't really affect anything else in the sweater. But actually, due to the way the lace is worked, every 10 rounds you have to move your beginning of round stitch marker 1 stitch over. So since I did 2 repeats, I had to move it 2 stitches over, and that ended up affecting where I placed my raglan increases and sleeves in relation to the neck shaping. So all I did was just move that beginning of round back over 2 stitches so it lined up with where I made my shaping. For the yoke increase rounds, the pattern just instructs you to make one and it doesn't give you a direction, which is fine. But I wanted to try an increase that's more invisible, so I started doing the lifted increase, which is very similar to a make one, but I found that actually looked way worse in this bigger gauge and it was a lot more visible than the make one. So I ended up just doing a make one left for all of my increases in the yoke, and that I think worked out in the best way that it could have. And then for the raglan shaping, it also just tells you to make one, and I ended up just doing directional make ones based on the direction of the raglan seams. So yeah, no issues, everything is going well so far. The next step is to split the sleeves from the body, so that's what I'm going to work on next, and then we're going to talk about adding bust darts. In knitting, there are two types of bust starts. There are vertical bust starts, where you use increases and decreases to shape your fabric and add width, but your actual bust dart is a vertical line, so that's why it's called vertical bust darts. Those types of bust darts are generally good when you're working on garments with negative ease. The other type of bust dart is called a horizontal bust dart, which is where you use short rows to add length to the front of your sweater, and the bust dart line is horizontal across the sweater, so that's why it's called horizontal. Horizontal bust darts are generally better for garments with a lot of positive ease, because you're not just adding more positive ease to the bust area, you are adding length so that the front of your sweater is not raised up higher than the back of your sweater. So there are a few measurements and numbers to figure out when you're calculating your bust darts. I'm only going to be talking about horizontal bust darts because that's what I'm doing for my sweater. Of course, vertical bust darts are worked differently. There are also multiple ways of doing pretty much all of this, as with most things in knitting. So, if you're looking to do this for your own sweater, there are lots of tutorials out there to reference that are more detailed and more comprehensive. So please don't take this as like a full tutorial. I'm mostly just going to be talking through what I'm doing for my sweater and kind of how I came to figure out how to make these bust darts work for me. So the first thing you want to do is figure out where to start your shaping. Generally, you want to start it right at the apex of the bust, or the fullest part of your bust. This tends to be like 1 to 2 inches beneath the underarm, but it really varies. So especially since you're already customizing your bust darts, the best thing to do here is just to measure your own body and make sure that everything lines up with those measurements. But as a general guideline, 1 to 2 inches beneath the underarm. For me, I'm going to work about 1 inch of fabric before I start my bust shaping. So the second thing you want to do is figure out how many stitches from the side seam you want to work your short rows. So if we're starting here at the underarm, right in the middle of the underarm stitches, so right at the side of the sweater, you could also go in 1 inch or 2 if you wanted to. So you could start, closer to here. I'm going to start at the very side seam of my sweater. So if we're starting here, you want to figure out how many stitches you want to work this way towards the center of your sweater. The main thing here is that you don't really want your short rows to stop right at the apex. That can just draw attention to things you might not want to. So you generally want to stay closer to sort of the side of your bust. So yeah, you can put your sweater on and measure out how many stitches that is. This tends to be like 1/4 or 1/3 of the front from that side seam. So that's sort of a general guideline, but again, the best thing to do is put your sweater on and actually measure yourself. So once you know where you're going to start your shaping and you know how many stitches you're actually going to work those shaping rows on, the last thing that you want to do is figure out how many short rows you want to knit. So there are quite a few different ways that you can measure yourself to figure out this number. One thing you can do is compare your upper bust to your full bust. For example, the difference between my upper bust and my full bust is 3 inches. So I could use that number and just add 3 inches of short rows to my sweater. But there's another way to measure that I think works a little bit better with horizontal bust darts, because you're measuring the difference between your shoulder to your waist on the front and your shoulder to your waist on the back, and comparing that difference. And I think that works a little better since we're adding length to the front. So I'll show you how you can do that. So take a piece of string or yarn and tie it around your waist, and then measure from your shoulder seam down across the fullest part of your bust into that piece of yarn around your waist. You might want to wear like a tight fitted t-shirt just to give you that shoulder seam reference. Make sure you're measuring from the same spot, because then you want to do the same thing but on your back. And it's probably easier if you have someone help you do this. So again, measure from your shoulder seam down your back into that string around your waist. And then you can take the difference between those two numbers and use that as your number for the length of your bust darts. So for me, that is 2 inches. So I want to add 2 inches of short rows. All right, so now that we have those numbers figured out, it's just a little bit of math to determine how many short rows to work and how many stitches to work in between your short row turns. So the first thing you want to do is multiply your difference that we just figured out, multiply that number by your row gauge. So my difference between my front and back is 2 inches, and my row gauge is 6 rounds per inch. So if I multiply 6 by 2, I get 12. So I know that I want to work a total of 12 rounds in my short rows. If we divide that by 2, we get how many short row sets we want to work, which is a little bit of an easier way to think about it. So if I want to work 12 rounds, I know that I want to work 6 sets of short rows back and forth. The last step is to divide the number of stitches in your bust darts, or your shaping stitches, by the number of short row sets. So I have 18 stitches of short rows on each side for each bust dart. So I'm going to divide that by 6, which is how many sets of short rows I'm going to be doing. And I get 3. So I know that I want to work 3 stitches in between each turn. And because I'm working German short rows, I will include my double stitch as one of those 3 stitches. If you get this number as a fraction, you can handle that in a couple different ways. You could either work an uneven amount of stitches between short row turns, or you could subtract or add a few stitches to your overall bust dart shaping stitches, kind of depending on whatever like works best for your sweater. So to recap what I'll be doing for my bust darts, I will be working 6 sets of short rows across 18 stitches on each side with 3 stitches in between each turn. The last thing that you want to think about before you start your bust darts is the type of shape that you're creating with the short rows. So with these types of short rows, there is sort of 2 shapes that we can create. The first is this kind of shape, a trapezoid. The other type of shape that we can create is this shape, an upside down trapezoid. So if we picture these shapes on an actual sweater, now clearly I'm not winning any awards here with my drawings, but hopefully you get the idea. So if we look at this line, which will be our turning line for our short rows, you can see that starting at the underarm, this line points up towards the top of the sweater. Whereas if we look at this shape, this line angles down towards the bottom of the sweater. So what we want to create with our short rows is this kind of shape. And if you look at the difference between the two, you can see that since we are knitting top down, we want to start with our shorter short rows first and gradually increase to our longer short rows. And if we do the opposite, where we start with our longest short rows first and get shorter and shorter, we're going to be creating this type of shape where the turn, or like the short row seam, is going to be angled down. So this is the type of shape that we want to create. So I've got my side seam markers here, and then I've got my bust dart markers here and here. So what I'll do is start at this side. I will work across the front to this bust dart marker. I'll work back to this bust dart marker, work again to my next short row turn and resolve that stitch, and then work however many stitches more that I've determined I need to. So that might be 3 stitches, for example. So I'll go 3 stitches past that turn and then turn again, work to where I turned last time, work 3 stitches past, turn again, up to where I turned last time, work another 3 stitches past, and keep going until I have worked all the way to my side markers on both sides. And then on the last round, I can resolve those last turning stitches. I'm going to use German short rows. I just think those generally look the best, so I would just resolve those double stitches in that case. I'm now ready to work my short rows, so I'm going to turn on an audiobook and get started. Okay, this is where I've made it. The bust darts turned out really well. It's kind of hard to see them, in part because this is black yarn and in part because they are supposed to be hidden with the German short rows, but they're there and they just add a little bit of extra fabric there at the bust. I finished the stockinette part of the body and I'm about to start the ribbing, and as soon as I bind off, that's going to be a good point to try it on. I also did try it on right after I split for the sleeves before I did the bust darts, so really the only thing to check here are the bust darts and the body length. I ended up knitting what's considered the full length in the pattern, which is, in my size, it's 7.5 inches from the underarm to the beginning of the ribbing. Anytime I transition from stockinette to ribbing, I will work 1 round of stockinette in my smaller size needles, the size I'll knit my ribbing in, and that really helps smooth out the transition from stockinette to ribbing. It also makes my knit stitches in my ribbing look just a little bit smaller, which is going to make the ribbing look nicer. And then anytime I work ribbing, I use combination knitting, which is where you purl the eastern purl or clockwise instead of counterclockwise. It removes some of the extra slack from your purl stitches, and so your ribbing looks a little neater. So those are just some of the things that I do every time I work ribbing. I'll work the bottom ribbing, I think it's about 1 inch, and then I'll bind off and try it on.
The provisional cast on at the neck was really easy to knit straight off the needle, so I do recommend this method. Just know that the beginning is a little fiddly. From here, I knit the neck ribbing. It was only a decrease round, followed by 5 rounds of ribbing, so it went super fast, and once I bound off, I was ready to try it on. The fit is looking really good. The bust darts fit nicely, they have a nice subtle shape without drawing too much attention to the shaping, and I like the cropped length with my high-waisted pants.
The neck turned out nicely as well. I did a tubular bind off on the neck and the body because I just can't resist that. You can tell that the front and the back are level thanks to the bust darts. So it's very cropped. I'm wearing a shirt under my pants, but you can tell like it hits kind of right at the top of my high-waisted pants. So next step, I will pick up the sleeve stitches and knit the sleeves, and then I'm done.
After this, I picked up for the first sleeve and it kind of flew off the needles. So I'll see you again when I'm ready to knit the second sleeve.
One thing that I like to do when I need a little bit of momentum to finish a second sleeve is I like to watch a subtitled movie, so a movie in a language that I don't speak and I have to read the subtitles. That really draws me in because I am forced to pay attention to the screen and I can just knit around and around in stockinette without really thinking too hard about it. So I've just picked up the sleeve stitches and knit 1 round. So I'm going to turn on my movie and see how much I can get done. I think I'm gonna watch Anatomy of a Fall because I haven't seen it yet. Okay, I just started this movie and I have to immediately point out that there is English in this movie. I think there's also French and German, but yeah, there is English. which is fine. That's not like a requirement, but it is also like 2.5 hours long, and I don't actually have time to watch the full thing right now. So I'm gonna switch gears, watch something else, but I'll still let you know how much I got done in however much time. Here's what I completed in just over about an hour and a half, so not bad. I'm pretty happy with this actually. So compared to my other sleeve, I have this much left. The way that I ensure my sleeves are exactly the same length, I count my rows. I just force myself to do it, and I never have sleeves that feel like they're different lengths, which I cannot stand the feeling of. So that's what I do. It works. I'm gonna go finish my sleeve now.
I finished the second sleeve shortly after filming that clip, and another thing I like to do to keep up momentum when I'm nearing the end of a project is to weave in all the ends before finishing the second sleeve. By the time I bind off, I only have one more end to weave in. It's sort of like starting a second sock before finishing the first one. You get the least fun things out of the way so that once you bind off, there's not much left to do. I don't do anything out of the ordinary to block my knits, but I always make sure to block them as soon as they're off the needles so I don't procrastinate. I use whatever wool wash I have on hand, Eucalan or soak, and usually I soak my knits in warm water. Something I nearly always do that has never failed me is I spin out the water using my washing machine. I always put my knits in a laundry bag so nothing snags, and I set my machine to a spin-only cycle so there's no heat or water involved. I just lay them out flat to finish drying, and they dry so fast. Here's my finished love note. This was a fun and fairly quick project, great for beginners looking to stretch their skills and experienced knitters who need a little palette cleanser. The pattern itself is a crisp 4 pages, so it doesn't include a lot of extra tips and information, but for me, this style of pattern writing is perfect. It's comprehensive with a schematic and sizing chart, written and charted stitch patterns, full instructions for how to work each segment, and options for different lengths. But the writing is concise, and it doesn't tell you anything you don't need to know. As far as modifications go, the mods I made were pretty minor. Adding bust darts is something I often have to do with patterns, and I prefer to customize them anyway for the best fit. The back neck shaping was to account for excluding the high-low hem written in the pattern, which, while I think it works for this design, isn't usually my style. The only other mods I made were binding off with a tubular bind off, since I always think that gives a nice finish, and lengthening the sleeves by 4 inches. This was because I wanted a longer sleeve than the pattern, but also because I have slightly long arms for my frame. I did also unintentionally alter the gauge, as you saw, which worked out nicely. My finished bust measurement was exactly what I calculated it was going to be, at 40¼ inches around. My full bust is 36 inches and my upper bust is 33 inches, so I ended up with just over 4 inches of positive ease at my full bust, not including the bust darts. This size is very comfortable for me. The back of the yoke sits against my back without bunching, and the front isn't stretched too tightly, especially with the added bust darts. I also wanted to follow up on my experience with the Knitting for Olive soft silk mohair. As far as mohair goes, I'm impressed with it. It's not too scratchy to wear, it wasn't too fussy to work with, besides occasionally stopping to untangle it, and it adds a pleasant fluff that works well with the lace pattern. I found it didn't shed too much while working with it, and it also doesn't make me sneeze like others tend to do. This will probably be my new go-to mohair. I still can't pretend that I love mohair. It really holds on to static electricity more so than wool in my experience, and of course it increases the price of a project by quite a bit, even though the Knitting for Olive mohair is relatively affordable. But there is something luxurious about it that I'm sure will draw me back in for future projects.